It was a moonless night over the Ruhr Valley in 1943, and the sound of engines came before the searchlights. Deep in the darkness, German radar operators watched their glowing green screens light up with blips, dozens, then hundreds. The alarm went out across western Germany. Enemy raid inbound. Minutes later, from airfields near Düsseldorf and Cologne, Luftwaffe night fighters scrambled into the blackness to intercept what had become the most feared visitor to German skies, the Avro Lancaster. Two German crews. The Lancaster looked ungainly, almost clumsy, with its massive wingspan, deep fuselage, and for thundering Merlin engines. It resembled a flying barn more than a sleek machine of war. The name stuck. Die Fliegen Scheune, the flying barn. It wasn't meant as a compliment. At first glance it seemed like a lumbering target, a big boxy shape that should have been easy prey for a Messerschmitt Bf 110 or a Ru 88 night fighter. But that assumption, as many German pilots discovered too late, was deadly wrong. The Lancaster wasn't just another bomber, it was the backbone of Britain's bomber command. Designed for one grim purpose, to carry destruction deep into enemy territory and bring its crew home again. What made it terrifying wasn't just its size or payload, it was what it represented. By the time the Lancaster arrived in large numbers in 1942, Germany was beginning to realize that the war it had unleashed was coming back to its cities in waves of fire. British designers hadn't intended beauty. When they built the Lancaster, they intended efficiency. Its cavernous bomb bay could hold over 14,000 pounds of explosives, and with later modifications, even more. In 1943, when the Royal Air Force launched the legendary Dambusters raid, it was the Lancaster that carried the massive 9,250-pound bouncing bombs. The bomber's power and stability allowed it to perform precision attacks that stunned even the German high command. Yet what unnerved German night fighter crews most wasn't just the Lancaster's destructive power, it was its resilience. Luftwaffe reports were filled with frustrated accounts. Target hit, bomber continues flying. Multiple cannon strikes. Still climbing. There were cases where a Lancaster returned home with half a tail missing, one engine gone, and its fuselage riddled with holes. Crews sometimes described the aircraft as alive, like a creature that refused to die. Even after being called a flying barn, it proved time and again that barns could burn. But this one always seemed to rise from the ashes. For German civilians, the name had another tone. They would listen in terror as sirens wailed over cities like Hamburg, Essen, and Berlin, knowing that those droning engines meant only one thing: the flying barns were overhead again. Bombs fell like rain, and the night sky glowed red as factories, homes, and entire neighborhoods vanished beneath firestorms. The raids were devastating not just physically, but psychologically. The Lancaster became a symbol of unstoppable punishment, slow, steady, and merciless. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe had developed sophisticated radar and interception tactics to counter the RAF's night raids. German night fighters used onboard radar to home in on bombers, and Schreckmusik, a deadly upward-firing cannon system, allowed them to attack from below the Lancaster's blind spot. But even these innovations came at a cost. Flying into a bomber stream of hundreds of aircraft was like diving into a steel cloud. The sky itself was a deadly chaos. Flares, tracer fire, burning planes falling like meteors. For every Lancaster lost, there was often a German pilot who didn't make it back either. One Luftwaffe ace reportedly said, "It is not the flying barn we fear, it is the fire it brings and the storm it lives in." Perhaps the most haunting image of the Lancaster was its silhouette against the flames. Survivors on the ground often recalled seeing them through the smoke. Great black shapes gliding silently after dropping their loads, moving together like shadows. They seemed untouchable. In the propaganda of Nazi Germany, the British were called cowards for bombing cities at night. But privately, even Goebbels admitted the effect was devastating to morale. Germany could replace factories and tanks, but not the spirit of a people who watched their world burn from the skies. Still, for the men inside those Lancasters, fear was as constant as the cold. The chances of surviving a full tour, 30 operations, were slim. They knew the statistics. Many didn't even unpack personal belongings at base, yet they climbed into their aircraft night after night, trusting in the same machine the enemy mocked as a flying barn. And maybe that was its secret. It didn't need to be beautiful, it just needed to keep going no matter the fire, no matter the flak, no matter the odds. The night skies over Germany were unlike anything the world had ever seen before. For the German night fighter crews, it was a deadly chessboard played in pitch darkness. Their job was to find and destroy the RAF bombers that thundered across the country almost every night, and the Lancaster, with its deep hum of 4 Merlin engines, was their most coveted kill. Yet, as many Luftwaffe pilots would confess later, hunting those flying barns often felt like stepping into a nightmare that wouldn't end in the early years of the war. Intercepting bombers was straightforward. Fighters went up, searched visually, and attacked. But by 1943, the scale of the RAF's bombing campaign had changed everything. Instead of a few planes, hundreds filled the sky at once, spread over miles. German radar operators on the ground directed their night fighters into these bomber streams using the Himmelbett system, a coordinated web of radar stations and searchlights. Pilots would fly blind until a ground controller's calm voice guided them. Target ahead, closing, prepare to engage. Inside those cockpits, the tension was unbearable. The radar screens glowed dimly, showing fuzzy dots, a Lancaster or maybe two. German pilots like Heinz Wolfgang Schnofer, who became one of the deadliest night fighter aces, would stalk the bombers silently. The trick was to approach from below and behind, where the Lancaster's gunners couldn't see you. Then came the innovation that changed night combat forever. Schrittmusik, slanted music, as the Germans called it, was a pair of upward-firing 20mm or 30mm cannons mounted behind the cockpit of a night fighter. The idea was horrifyingly simple and brutally effective. Instead of attacking from behind, the German fighter flew just under the bomber and fired into its belly, the most vulnerable part. Pilots would see the sparks light up above them as their shells tore through the Lancaster's fuel tanks or bomb bay. Within seconds, the flying barn would erupt into flame, tumbling out of the sky like a burning comet. But even this deadly method didn't guarantee success. The Lancaster was built tough. Its vast frame could absorb astonishing punishment. Crews often kept flying with parts of their wings shredded, engines ablaze, or half the fuselage gone. Many German pilots, even the best, learned that the kill was never certain. Some reported seeing the same bomber they thought they had destroyed still limping home toward the English Channel. It became almost superstitious. The flying barn wouldn't die unless it wanted to. Then there were the gunners. Every Lancaster had multiple defensive positions, nose, mid-par and tail turrets, each armed with .303 Browning machine guns. These men were trained to scan the night endlessly, eyes straining for the faintest glimmer of an approaching enemy. A good rear gunner could make a German ace's life a living hell. Many Luftwaffe pilots spoke of the terror of being spotted. One burst of tracers from a Lancaster's tail could turn hunter into hunted in an instant. Some pilots tried to come in low, so close they could see the red glow of the bomber's exhausts. Others climbed above and dove through the formation, letting off short bursts and then diving away before the gunners could lock on. It was a deadly game of nerves. One mistake meant falling from the sky in a fireball. The psychological toll was immense. As RAF technology improved, German night fighter pilots found their own chances of survival shrinking. The British introduced radar jamming devices like window strips of aluminum. Foil dropped from bombers to confuse radar screens. Suddenly, the neat, glowing dots vanished into chaos. Controllers couldn't guide their fighters anymore. The sky became a blind maze where friend and foe blended together. Many Luftwaffe aces called those nights the Black Ocean, where death floated unseen. Even when Lancaster burned, the sight wasn't one of victory, it was haunting. Crews watched the massive bombers spiral down through the clouds, sometimes exploding in midair, sometimes breaking apart silently. The glow of fire would light up the faces in the German cockpits. Some pilots later admitted to feeling something close to pity. You could see them fighting it, trying to keep the plane level, one recalled. They knew they were done, but they never gave up. By late 1944, as the tide of war turned, those once dreaded Lancaster formations grew even larger and more organized. The RAF's bomber streams stretched across the sky like moving cities, guided by new radar systems that made night operations deadlier than ever. German pilots who once hunted with confidence now spoke of dread when the warning sirens went off. They keep coming, one Luftwaffe lieutenant wrote in his diary. Every night, more of them. They are everywhere. They are not machines anymore, they are ghosts. In the end, the Germans realized something ironic. The nickname Flying Barn no longer sounded like mockery. It was respect disguised as ridicule. That Lancaster was big, yes, but it was built for endurance, not elegance. And that endurance made it the nightmare of every man who had to face it in the dark. For the men who climbed into the Lancaster every night, the sky was both their battlefield and their graveyard. They were young, most barely out of their teens, yet they carried the weight of a nation's vengeance on their shoulders. Each mission began the same way. Silence on the ground, engines rumbling to life, and that deep vibration that went through the chest before takeoff. Once the aircraft lifted from the runway, there was no sound but the endless drone of 4 Merlins. The world below disappeared, and so did everything that made them human, until the sun rose again, if it ever did for them. Life aboard the Lancaster was claustrophobic and loud. Despite its size, space was tight. 7 men shared that flying barn: pilot, flight engineer, navigator, barmaker, wireless operator, mid-upper gunner, and tail gunner. Each had his station, each his duty. They rarely saw each other once in the air. The intercom crackled with short, clipped words, no chatter, no jokes, not after the first few missions. The cold was bony. Frost formed on the inside of windows, and oxygen masks froze solid with breath. At 20,000 feet, even a small hole from a bullet could turn the fuselage into an icy wind tunnel. The danger wasn't just from the enemy, it was from everything. Oxygen failure, engine fires, mid-air collisions in the bomber stream, bombs from another Lancaster dropping too soon above them. The sky over Germany was a storm of chaos. Flares burst, Searchlights swept, and the dark horizon glowed with fire from burning cities. And still, the Lancaster crews pressed on, knowing that one mistake could turn them into a flash of light and a falling memory. Inside the fuselage, the bomb aimer lay flat on his stomach in the nose, peering through the bomb sight, his face inches from freezing glass. He was the one who had to open the bomb bay doors, line up the target, and release the destruction carried in their belly. "Steady, steady," he would whisper, as anti-aircraft shells burst around them, shaking the aircraft like thunder. "Bombs gone," he'd finally say, and for a brief moment, the Lancaster felt lighter, almost free. Behind him, the navigator hunched over glowing maps, tracing their course by the faint light of a lamp. Every second mattered. If they strayed too far off route, they could drift into another bomber stream or worse, into enemy fighter territory. The pilot, usually the oldest of the crew, was the heartbeat of the aircraft. He couldn't see much, just the faint glow of instruments and the ghostly horizon ahead, but he had to trust every man behind him. Many crews said the same thing. You didn't fly the Lancaster alone. You survived it together. And then, at the very back, was the loneliest man in the war, the tail gunner, trapped inside a tiny glass bubble. He was the first to see death coming and the last to escape it. There was no armor, no escape hatch, and little warmth. Just for machine guns, a narrow seat, and an endless black sky. Many called it the coffin. German night fighters loved to attack from below and behind, exactly where the tail gunner sat. Still, they kept watch, hour after hour, whispering over the intercom. "Fighter at 6 o'clock low. Keep turning. Skipper." When they finally returned to base, if they did, the ground crew would count the bullet holes, the shredded metal, the broken glass. Some planes landed with one engine gone, sometimes two. Some touched down with dead men still strapped in their seats. There were nights when only half of a squadron returned. The rest were gone, lost over the North Sea, shot down over the Ruhr, vanished without trace. The next morning, their bunks would be cleared, their names quietly removed from the board. No ceremony, no farewell, just the unspoken rule that the war went on yet. Despite the terror, despite the odds, the Lancaster crews took pride in their aircraft. They trusted it like a living thing. "She'll bring us home," they said. And often, she did, dragging herself across the channel with holes the size of fists in her wings, or with a wounded pilot barely conscious at the controls. Many ground crews said they could always hear a Lancaster coming home before they saw it, the familiar deep hum, uneven but steady, like a heartbeat returning from hell. To the men inside, the flying barn wasn't a joke. It was a fortress, a guardian, a symbol of survival. The name carried irony. Yes, it was big and awkward, but it kept them alive in the worst skies imaginable. Every dent, every patch of scorched paint told a story. Some airmen even talked to their planes before missions, touching the nose, whispering promises. They didn't believe in luck, but they believed in her. And when they finally landed after a raid, hands frozen, eyes bloodshot, ears ringing from hours of engine roar, they stepped out into the damp night air and looked back at their aircraft, still steaming from the cold. They never said it out loud, but in their hearts, they knew she had carried them through the fire again. For the RAF, the cost was staggering. Of the more than 7,000 Lancasters built, over 3,200 were lost in combat. Tens of thousands of airmen never returned home. The survival rate was worse than for infantry in the trenches of World War I. Every mission was a gamble with death, yet the morale of Bomber Command stayed unbroken. They knew their role: to cripple Germany's war industry and to hasten the end. Every man who flew in those flying barns carried scars that never faded. When they returned, they didn't talk much about the raids. They remembered the faces of those who didn't come back, the empty bunks, the engines that never started again. But they also remembered the strength of their aircraft, how many times it had brought them home when no one thought it could. It was ugly, yes, but in its ugliness, there was something noble, raw determination, built into rivets and steel. The ground crews treated the Lancasters like living creatures. After every mission, they patched holes, replaced engines, cleaned out the bomb bays. They worked through freezing nights, bleeding knuckles, and exhaustion. The men flying them often said, "She'll get us there. They'll get us back." When the war finally turned in 1945, it was clear that the flying barn had done its part. The German war machine was broken, its cities shattered. Even the most hardened Nazi officers could no longer ignore the nightly terror of the skies. The sight of those black silhouettes passing overhead became the symbol of defeat. For the German people, it was the sound of war coming home. Yet, even among the ruins, respect lingered. Captured Luftwaffe pilots admitted their admiration. The Lancaster, one said, was a beast. You could shoot at it all night and it would not die. For all the propaganda that mocked it, the truth was undeniable. It was the most feared bomber of the war, not because it was invincible, but because it refused to give up. In April 1945, the final Lancaster raids flew over a collapsing Reich. There was little left to destroy. When peace came, the men who had flown the flying barn returned home to quiet lives. Some became farmers, some mechanics, some never spoke again of what they saw, but they all remembered the sound, that deep, steady roar that had carried them through fire and death. Today, only a few Lancasters remain airworthy. When one flies at an air show, people stop and listen. The engines rumble through the air, and those who know history feel it in their bones. That sound once meant destruction, fear, and courage all at once. The flying barn is no longer a weapon. It's a ghost of a time when the sky itself was a battlefield. Historians still debate the morality of the bombing campaigns, whether the destruction of cities was necessary or too terrible to justify. But beyond politics, one truth remains. The Lancaster was not just a bomber. It was a symbol of endurance, of men who faced impossible odds, and of a machine that turned ridicule into respect. The Germans had called it Die Fliegend Scheuen, the flying barn, to mock its bulky frame. But in the end, they feared that sound in the night more than anything else. It was the sound of retribution, of power, of fate approaching slowly on 4 engines. It was the sound of a world changing forever.